folks. So, UrbanCode Deploy. I want to talk to you today about deployment automation with UrbanCode. And the purpose of UrbanCode is to do precisely that. It's to automate and take control of a lot of the deployment operations that you perform today. Now, everybody I meet as customers of UrbanCode or prospective customers of UrbanCode already has a way of deploying their applications today. But for many of them, it's a very cryptic, very scripted way of working, managed by a small number of people, and very difficult to maintain, very difficult to develop and enhance. So on the one hand, while you have very agile and reactive ways of developing your applications in terms of the application code, the deployment mechanisms often become something that is looked upon as a little bit fragile, hard to maintain, hard to deal with, and something that people avoid making any changes to because they worry about breaking it, basically. Now, that might not be the exact case in your organization, but that's what we see a lot of the time. So we see a variety of different scripting technologies. We'll see a bit of Chef, a bit of Puppet, and Puppet being extended from infrastructure management into actual deployments of operations. We'll also see activities being performed in Jenkins, where Jenkins is being stretched from the left, if you like, if you think about a life cycle going through the requirements on one side for a running application over on the right-hand side. So we see Jenkins being stretched from being a build automation technology, which it's fabulous at doing, into more areas of deployment automation and interacting with running systems. And while some of those things might be okay in development environments, because you just build the code and you deploy it into development, and it's a nice, seamless way of working in small development environments, it starts to struggle a little bit in areas where you have, where you're trying to deploy it into production environments. And not many organizations, when you reach a certain scale, really, are that interested in connecting their production systems to a development Jenkins machine. So you end up with a proliferation of Jenkins servers around the organization, which again is hard to manage. You end up with handing off tasks and processes by hand, and it's not very streamlined. So what we try to do with Deploy is put a really good separation between the development and the runtime environments. Whilst this fabled term of DevOps is often used to bring development and operations and the teams together, there's often a pretty good reason to keep them apart, to be honest. And there are times when you need to do that. So having a system that is robust and strong within separating the two and being the bridge between the two is the right way to go about this. So you have strong governance over the environments, you have great control over who can do what, where and when, to what, with what content. And that's what UrbanCode is trying to do for you. So moving us away from the variety of scripted operations we have into something that is much easier to read, much easier to deal with, and easier for everybody all around. So that's a quick introduction to the main objectives of UrbanCode. And really I want to start off by explaining some of the components and parts of the application by describing the main building blocks of UrbanCode. So we have an application that you wish to deploy, which is shown in the top left corner of that particular image. And that application is made up of a number of components. So we've got two components shown here, and each of those components has a process for deploying it. And you can probably think about applications that you have within your environment right now that break down into a number of different components across different technologies. So you might think of component 1 as being some WebSphere application server. Component 2 might be some message broker. Component 3 might be some MQ content, because those are the main aspects that we're going to be talking about today. But equally, they could span a variety of different technologies, some of which are not related to IBM at all. So we can deploy into WebSphere, into Oracle environments, into Tomcat, into JBoss, a variety of different technologies and a variety of different runtimes. We can also deploy standards, what you might call as standard content as well, of video files, of static web pages, of text that needs to change, of database changes. And we can make operational changes as well. You need to reconfigure a runtime environment, such as a WebSphere application server, where you might want to change a thread pool setting or a heap size setting. We can manage all of those things as well. And we do all these different technical things that I'm describing here with the processes that are embedded into the components. So at that level there, we are being very specific about the technology that we're interacting with, being very specific about the activities that we're performing. And the plugins that we have within UrbanCode go down to that level, and that's what I'm going to be showing you a little bit later on today. Now, within those components as well, we have a number of properties that need to be managed. And if you think about the applications that you deploy today, you probably have lots of configuration files that contain different settings for different environments, or for this resource, that might be IP addresses, port numbers, heap size settings, URLs for database connections, and all of those sorts of things. And some of those things are specific to the environment that you're deploying to. Some of them are fixed across all environments. And UrbanCode Deploy will manage all of those for you. So when we start to deploy UrbanCode to an organization, we tend to have a fairly detailed conversation about properties, about what that property actually relates to, where we should put it, and what the right thing to do with that particular property is. Now, we're going to be deploying content for our components as well, and UrbanCode Deploy can store multiple versions of those components for you. So again, we're taking away the absolute need to have some additional software technology within your organization. A lot of people put in a repository of some kind to store the content that they will be deploying. So source code management contains such as Rational Team Concert, ClearCase, Subversion, Git. Those types of technologies contain the source code. And once you've built the content, you then need to store those binary artifacts somewhere, such that you can hand them off to a deployment solution and they can actually be deployed into an environment. Now, UrbanCode Deploy will hold those for you, and there's good reason to do that. Because you will have multiple versions of the content deployed into different environments, often be having newer things in development and test environments, and slightly older things in production as you progress them through a life cycle, then it's great to have that content in UrbanCode, because we can do some comparisons on the content. We can show you what versions have been deployed to where. If you're deploying into 30 or 40 different environments, perhaps, then it's really useful to know what versions exist where and have that inventory. And that capability in UrbanCode is something that attracts a lot of customers above and beyond the fact that it can just manage and deploy whatever content you like. Now, thinking about the components as well, we need to get the content into those components, and the source is probably a bad word to use on the diagram there, really, to be perfectly honest, because we're not talking about source code, let's be perfectly clear. We're talking about the content that needs to be used in that component. And this could be a jar file that's to be deployed into a runtime system. It could be a broker archive file, a bar file for MQ, and it could be, sorry, for broker, get the right technology the right way around, or it could be some SQL scripts for database changes. It can be anything we want, but it is the artifacts, the files that we will use in respect to that particular component. And then rolling all this together, looking back at the application, we have a process in the application as well. But the process there really relates to just the orchestration of those components, and really allows us to sort of sort the components into order. If you have 40 or 50 components that you need to deploy for a particular application, there may be some of those that need to be serialized so that we can do them in a specific order and only do parts 2, 3, and 4 if number 1 has been successfully completed. If it doesn't, then we'll stop. But equally, there might be steps 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11 that we can do in parallel. And it's to everyone's advantage to do as many things in parallel as we possibly can in terms of speed. So the orchestration process in the application layer really is all about that, is identifying what needs to be done in parallel, what needs to be done in serial, what needs to be confirmed to be complete before something else happens. Now, our applications connect us to specific environments for each application. And here you can see that we've got a development environment, system integration test, pre-production and production. And they get progressively more involved and more detailed as we go through. So in a development environment, we're basically running everything on a single server. So we've got our application server, our web content, and our database all on one development box, and that's fine. Then we move to system integration test, and we've got an application server and a web content server. So we're breaking that function down into 2 separate machines, and we have a separate database server. And when we get to pre-production and production, we're introducing there the notion of a load balancer. Now we can manage all of those artifacts. We can manage the component processes that we create for deploying the content into those without making any changes to it. So regardless of the fact that the environment has become more complex and separated out and more diverse, to us it's basically just a particular resource that we're addressing. So when I deploy my bar file in development, it goes to the one box I have. In my system integration test, it goes to a specific name machine. And UrbanCode will take care of that. So we map our components to actual physical resources so that UrbanCode knows when you run in that particular component process, you're going to run it on that particular machine. And it may be that there are some things that you run on 20 machines at the same time. It's that adaptable. It really doesn't care where we run in things. So that's a quick introduction to UrbanCode Deploy. I really wanted to give you that sort of background setting, scene setting, before we dived into any of the specific technologies, because some of you might be new to UrbanCode completely. I do apologize to those of you that have known UrbanCode for a while and want to just get to the meat of what we can do for particular technologies today of MQ and Broker. But I'm going to close that diagram down. If anybody wants a copy of that, let me know. It's just markroberts@uk.ibm.com. That's just markroberts@uk.ibm.com. No spaces or dashes or dots between Mark and Roberts. Alternatively, just contact Helen at Ranger 4, and she'll be able to get you a copy of that or put you in touch with me. So hopefully now you can see Internet Explorer. I'm going to show you everything today to do with UrbanCode through this particular interface. As a user of UrbanCode, you will work through a web interface. That's all you need to work with it. There are no plugins to download. There is a command line client that you can download from this top left corner up here, from the tools menu if you wish. And there's the command line interface is often used, and the command line interface is often used to connect us to other third-party systems such as Jenkins. So when we do our connectivity to that, we do it through the command line. And the simple part there really is that Jenkins will produce a build of, say, a jar file or a WAR file. It will then have a couple of commands inserted that will push that new content to be deployed into UrbanCode Deploy, into a new component version. And once it's done that, it can then initiate a deploy operation. So we have a complete sequence where you can go from the developer commits some changes into Git. Jenkins will spot that and will start the build running, maybe run some unit tests along the way, and then Jenkins will push that into UrbanCode, instruct UrbanCode to deploy, and you've got your application deployed and started in your runtime environment, all from the developer committing some code. It's as simple as that. It's as seamless as that. We get great linkage through from one area to the other as well. And if anybody wants to talk a little bit more about Jenkins and how we connect that to UrbanCode, then again, let Helen Beale know at Ranger 4, and we can sort out that particular conversation with you. So I'm trying to slow down a little bit now, and I've gone through that introduction quite quickly, but we did lose a bit of time, so I wanted to get through that quite quickly. We're looking at the UrbanCode Deploy user interface. We have across the top here a number of different tabs within the application. It may prompt me to log in a second when I click on something here, it may not. And we have a number of applications listed here that we can use. And what I'm interested in today is just an application called WebSphere Message Broker and MQ. As soon as I go into an application, the first thing I see is my route to live. And it's very important that we see this as the very first sort of entry point into our application, because here I am looking down my UrbanCode Deploy environments from development, QA, pre-production, and production. And behind each of those banner sections there, I have a number of resources that I am deploying my application to. And just by clicking on this particular environment, let's just click on the QA one in here, I see that the resources that I'm deploying to, and in here it's just one physical resource with the WebSphere Message Broker component sitting under that, but it could equally be 20 or 30 machines under there that we're deploying to. We don't really care. Now at the application level here, I have a number of processes, and the process I'm going to run today is deploy message queue and broker flow. And at a high level, to look at that orchestration activity, all I see is these two purple boxes here. And very clearly named. One is create and start a queue for the broker, and the other one is deploy to WebSphere message broker. So very simple operations that we're going to do coming out of our WebSphere message broker component. There's some MQ operations in here as well, and I'm going to show you the detail that's behind those in a second. But that's all we have at the top level orchestration, so it's very clear here to see what's happening. We have to do the first part before we do the second. If I wanted to run these in parallel, I could do that just by moving things around, click and drag, and I've now got a parallel process. But in the scenario here, that's not going to work because I need the queue to be in place before I deploy the WebSphere message broker to it. Now, one of the things that will become pretty obvious here to any of you who are real experts in these technologies is that to use UrbanCode, you're in a much better position to use UrbanCode in your applications than I am actually, because I know UrbanCode quite well, but I don't know the details specifically of what you need to do to WebSphere message broker and MQ. You know that already. You probably have that in scripted operations, and that means that between us, we could come up with a way of working with UrbanCode in your environment very quickly. But in that scenario, it's really easy for you to learn UrbanCode. And coming at this as an UrbanCode person and trying to deal with the 100-odd different technologies that we deploy to is actually quite difficult for the folks from IBM, because we don't deal with those technologies on a day-to-day basis. You do, but it's much easier for you to learn UrbanCode than it is for us to learn all these different technologies. I'm sure you know it takes a bit of time to learn some of these technologies. So I'm going to quit out of that. I'm not going to save that change to that particular component, to that process, and I'm going to show you this running in a second. But before we do that, I want to drill into some of these different areas, and I want to go into the components. So by going into the components, if you remember back to our diagram, I want to zoom. We're now looking at the detail of the component processes within here, so I'm focused on the component. And there's a few things in here that I really want to show to you. So I'm going to go into my WebSphere message broker part first. And if I go into versions, you can see that I've got a number of versions of content that I want to deploy for broker. And if we look into one of these versions, look at number 3.0, you can see that there's just a bar file in here, very simple bar file.bar. It's 3.5K, it's not particularly large, but I just have one here. You could have 20 or 30 different bar files, you could have other content in there, and that can be content that is created by a developer using the broker designer, and then you could push that content into UrbanCode Deploy really easily. Alternatively, you could just put that content onto a particular location on a machine, and UrbanCode could be monitoring that location, looking for new content to appear, and when new content does appear, it pulls it into UrbanCode as new versioned content. There's lots of things that we can do behind this. We can store information inside UrbanCode and use that information about this particular version. I've been doing something specifically like that for another customer recently, where we're pulling test artifacts in from a customer, and then we're storing different metadata that the customer supplies about that version of the test artifact actually on the versioned items within UrbanCode Deploy. Now, one of the things that you might have spotted on here when we came to this screen a second ago to look at these different versions is that I have a status shown on this one saying ready for production. Now, you can create and manage whatever statuses you like to indicate some sort of quality marker or to show some particular status of each version. What we can then do within UrbanCode is we can say, unless a version has a particular status on it, it cannot be deployed into that specific environment. We can also govern who is allowed to put those statuses onto those versions. So this allows us to ensure that only certain people can stamp content to say that's been approved and is ready to go. And without that stamp, it can't get into that next environment. So it's really easy to control the sort of quality pipeline that you have flowing through the organization of people performing tests, stamping content to say it is ready to go into a particular environment, and then controlling the progression into that environment as necessary. So as I say, you design what statuses you want, and you decide when you will apply them. Now, you can actually apply them as steps as well. And I'm going to show you the detail of a component process in a second, and you'll be able to see exactly how these things can be applied. So let's go to the component process now. And within here, we have two processes that I'm particularly interested in. One is create and start the queue manager, and then we're going to have a look at the deploy broker. So let's have a look at the create and start queue manager to start with. And this is the main palette design activity that we perform within UrbanCode Deploy for a specific component. So down here, what I'm focused on at the moment is a particular technology and what I actually want to do with it. And it might be creating, it might be starting, it might be stopping, it might be removing, it might be reconfiguring, whatever operations it is. And generally, you would have put these types of activities into a shell script of some kind, or some sort of scripted batch file perhaps. Here we are drawing them out in these nice purple boxes and putting parameters into these boxes so that it's very easy for the person doing the design work. It's obvious what information you have to supply at each stage. It's very easy for someone else to come and look at this. So even if you have my limited knowledge of MQ, you can read through this and say, well, we're creating a queue manager, we're starting it, we're running through some configuration, starting a service, and then starting a channel. And to those of you that know MQ well, you'll understand what sort of thing that's doing. And you probably think about another half a dozen different things that you would probably do around that. What we often see is sort of a lot of topping and tailing of these processes with a lot of pre-work done to say, is the environment ready? Is this in place? Is that in place? Do we have enough disk space available? Are all these things ready? If they are, great, let's carry on. Let's do some work. And then we'll see the tail end of a process at the bottom of these types of screens that show, well, okay, let's go and check that's been done. And let's check that's been done properly. Check that's started. Check that's configured properly. Check that's been removed. So it's fine to build in those sorts of checks. It's very useful to do that because you end up really with a bit of a belt and braces approach to things. There's nothing wrong with that at all. So what I want to do to start with is show you how we do this design work. And over on the left-hand side here, we have a number of items listed in this utility palette over here. I'm going to go and find the particular technology that we're interested in. So here we've got middleware, go to messaging, go into WebSphere MQ, and here you can see that we've got the Create Queue Manager that we had over here. And we've got quite a few things available to us. Lots and lots of steps there for setting up channels, for setting permissions, for running MQ batch scripts, importing certificates, deleting content, defining content, and so on. And if I take one of these steps here to create Queue Manager and just drag and drop this on the screen, I'm prompted then to fill in a piece of information about that particular step. So it has a name. I'll put -2 on the end because I already have one called Create Queue Manager at the top. I'll give the Queue Manager a name. I'll give the Queue Manager a description. And I've got a command directory. Now you can see here that we have this strange syntax in this one, $resource/webspheremq.command path. That's to identify the command path for this particular resource. Now, you might be deploying to different machines with different architectures. And on a Solaris box, you might have the WebSphere MQ command path set to one thing. On a Linux box, it might be something else. On AIX, it might be necessary to put it somewhere else. You might have a machine that ran out of disk space, so you have to move some content onto a different partition. Basically, what I'm saying is that you have the opportunity here to specify where the WebSphere MQ path is on every single resource that we have. And while we have that on screen, I want to go and take you to that resource now and show you where this command path is set. So I have my list of resources here. I've gone across to another tab in Internet Explorer. If I look at my resources here, I can drill down into the hierarchy that I have. So we have a great way of representing what can literally be for many customers is up to thousands and thousands of machines in a list, and keeping them in some sort of hierarchy is a very useful thing to do. So I have here my agent 85-development, that's the machine I'm using, and I've mapped my components for WebSphere, Message Broker, and MQ under that particular resource. So if I go and click on that resource and have a look at its configuration and its basic properties, what you will see is that down here somewhere we have the WebSphere MQ command path. And on this particular machine, it's opt/mqm/bin, which I think might be a fairly default sort of path. You also see other things in here that we're using. So we've got the WebSphere message broker/broker. We've got a queue manager by name. And we've got the IP address that is used in some of these operations as well. If I go back into here, and there aren't any hidden properties on this one, but one of these things down here has the IP address that you'll see in a second. So I'm just going to save that step over here. If I click on the little pencil next to one of these, we bring up the editor. So on here you can see that we've got the queue manager by name. I should probably put that in as a this WebSphere message broker queue manager, to use a variable for it, so that if I wanted to change the queue manager name, I'd only have one place to go to make that change, rather than make that change in every single step that we have. Factor it out into a resource property, so that I only have to make that change once. I do have a starving cat coming around me at the moment. The perils of working from home, so I do apologise if you can hear a moggy. Shut this door. Please don't report me to the RSPCA for not feeding the cat. Now, one thing you can see down here is user impersonation. And this is really important because there will be different commands that you need to perform as different user IDs. So we have a user here called MQM, and a password that's been put in that we can't see, that's being used to run that particular command to start that queue manager for us. Now, there's a few other things that we can do here, like running, what's that step? Running MQ scripts, and we can supply the script data in here. So it's not scrolling down the screen particularly well. In other browsers, you often get a little thing in this corner that you can drag to the side, and it will make this window much bigger. But if you already have lots of scripted things in here, then you can paste these things straight into UrbanCode Deploy, and it makes the transition into using UrbanCode much, much easier for you. Other things we have down here are the opportunity to introduce shell commands as well. Even if there are things listed down in that large palette of commands on the left-hand side there may be things there that don't cover every single operation that you perform, well, you can still come out as shell commands. And I've shown an example here of starting the queue and running the MQ listener and listing those just as shell commands. So you may sometimes have to put a path in there to identify where they are. You can put a working directory that will specify where to go and run those commands on that particular target machine. But you do have the opportunity to introduce shell commands in here as well. And I'll show you the output of running those shortly so you can see how those operate. Now, I'm not going to save that one. I'm going to go back and have a look now at our broker deployment activity. Let's have a look at the deploy broker. Now, this one in here, we've got a number of shell commands listed down here. The first thing we do, though, is we download the artifacts. The download artifacts is often the first command that you will have within an UrbanCode Deploy process, particularly one that has versioned content. So we saw version 3.0 earlier on, the bar file that was listed in there, and so this will download that bar file onto the target machine that we're running our deployment on, and it will then allow us to use that. We then go and use a shell command to go and create the broker. So that's just some standard operations that you'll use to create the broker. I'm using the MQSI profile command. What you can also see in here, it's quite useful to have, is that we are making use of some of those properties. So we're using $p:/resource/ WebSphere message broker, queue manager, and so on and so on. So we're using a lot of opportunity there to use properties within the scripted operations that we can perform. We're then going to use the MQ deploy command, and we're going to deploy the bar file by its particular name. We're going to go and locate that. So we've got properties here for the execution group, the IP address, the port number, the queue manager. So I could now go and actually deploy this bar file to any number of resources that I have within my organization, provided that they have got WebSphere message broker installed. But so long as I know their IP address is the port that I want to use, I have all that managed within the operational area of UrbanCode in that resource tree, then that's all fine. Now this is where we can actually introduce one of the nice separations between the development world and the operational world, because here I'm looking at something that might be regarded as sort of development. It's a broker person that's going to be creating these processes to decide how to deploy them. But if we flip back over to here, I'm looking here at lists of resources, and different people will be managing that physical infrastructure, or more likely that virtual infrastructure that provides the resources here that we are using. And it's likely that a developer is not going to have access to these two production broker files that I'm representing down here as broker 1 and broker 2. So we can have a nice degree of separation that only certain people with the right IDs in UrbanCode Deploy can manage the properties on those particular machines here. If I click on here, I don't think I have anything configured for them, but I would expect to see in that list there all of those MQ settings that we saw previously associated with these production devices. So we have a nice separation between the people that define the process, the people that define the properties that will run against in a production environment. Now, don't be concerned about the fact that you might think, well, actually, we've probably got quite a few resource properties there, quite a few things that we need to define in order for our deployments to operate across these different technologies. Well, one thing we can do, if we go back to our component for a second, and let's just drop out of this process here. Let's go back to our component. Okay, it's warning me. And in here, we can have resource property definitions. Now, I don't have any defined here at the moment, but if I go and define a property in here, and let's call it broker name. Give it a meaningful name. We can give it a label as well if we wish. The description is what appears on the right-hand side. I float the mouse over it, so I'll call this one. And I can even define a pattern if I want to, a regular expression that will dictate the rules that that particular broker name has to get applied to. I can specify what type it is, so it could be a checkbox. If you want a true false value, it can be a text area if you've got quite a bit of text to put in. It can be a selection from available values. This is good if you want to select, maybe, I don't know, DB2, SQL Server, MySQL. If you wanted to select the database type, you could have a select box there, multiple selects, and you can have secure properties, which means that the text is not displayed on screen. You can collect the passwords. If I specify that as being required, anytime when I create a new definition of this component on a particular resource, UrbanCode will say, well, if you want to use that component on that resource, I need to know the broker name and any other properties. So it will prompt you at that point. So as the architect of this particular component, I can dictate to any operational person the information they need to provide to use this particular component in their environment. And that's a really useful thing to do, because it makes sure that you don't reach the point of starting to perform a deployment and then find a property hasn't been filled in properly. There's another property that's missing. You don't have any of that happening because you define them there. And you can define properties that have to be provided at the resource level. So on this machine, you need to tell me what that particular value is in the environment. So you might put things, something like a database URL to say, if you're going to deploy this particular runtime onto that WAS platform, you need to tell me what the database URL is that you're connecting to. Are you connecting to your test database, your production database, your QA database? Which one is it going to be? And so on. So defining properties like that, as I said when we were looking at that diagram earlier on, property definitions are really important in UrbanCode. Very important that we get them right. We put them in the right place. We guide the team to make sure they fill them in properly. And then it's really easy for us to make sure that everything is complete as we need it to be. Now, while we were looking at that particular plugin step, you may have spotted things that would be useful to you, you may not. So what I want you to have a look at after this, if you wish, is go Google for UrbanCode Deploy plugins, and you will get to this screen. Very simple, just go and have a Google for UrbanCode Deploy plugins. You'll get to this screen, and this lists all of the plugins that are available. There's 137 of them now. But if you just put in here broker, it will take you to the IBM integration bus, to use the proper name there, forming the WebSphere message broker. And you can go to that particular plugin, and you can view the plugin documentation, which is all web-based, and you can look at the steps that are available. And it will list the steps that are available for integration bus. And if you want to go and have a look at the WMB deploy step, you can see down here the parameters that are provided, whether they are mandatory, the ones that have a little red asterisk on them on the screen that we looked at earlier. And this text here in the description is the text that floats up on the screen inside UrbanCode Deploy as you look at those processes. So I'm going to go back into one of those very quickly. Let's just have a look at that one. And if we look at this particular step, you've got things like the timeout value, and the text that floats up there is the exact text that you'll see down here, the timeout value. So if you, some of you that don't have UrbanCode Deploy installed today, if you want to have a look through the steps that are available and the sorts of things you can do to these technologies in a bit more detail, then please do go back to go to the plugins page and have a look at them. Just to go and have a look at the other one that we looked at earlier on as well. If you go to the MQ, go to that plugin, again view the documentation, and this is the one that had a larger list of steps available to it, and all of the documentation is there, well, short descriptions and parameter descriptions to show what you need to provide for each function or each step that we have. That's quite useful. So it's about time we went and ran something, isn't it, really? So let's go back up to our application, go to WebSphere message broker, and I'm going to run this through my development environment. I'm going to go, and I have run this before, so I'll clear that checkbox. So when I go to deploy an application in a particular environment using this button here, a list of the processes for that particular application will appear. So I'm going to pick that I want to do a deploy operation. Then I need to choose the version. And we've got multiple versions of the broker file. If you remember, we looked and we had version 1 and 2 and 3, and version 1 was the only one that was marked as being ready to go into production. So let's pick version 3, the latest one. I'll redeploy the current version that's been deployed previously and hit submit. And UrbanCode now has started off that deployment. It tells me the environment we are deploying to, and we can track this as it goes through. It goes through quite quickly, so I'm going to step through here, and you can see the steps being executed as it runs. Keeps refreshing the screen, and that's it. The create and start queue manager has been run. I'll have a look at some of those detail of those operations in a second. But we're now running through now the steps of deploying the broker. It's performing those operations. You can drill into the detail if you wish to stop the screen from bouncing around a little bit. And you can drill into the detail. We're now looking at the component process in detail, setting some broker properties. And that's it. That's talk quickly to cover any ground on that. That only took 24 seconds to run. We do have some of these that take, a few minutes to deploy other operations. I have some examples if anyone wants to see them of deploying WebSphere application server, the actual runtime, creating profiles, deploying applications. So we go from absolutely nothing to an application running on WebSphere application server in, I think it's about 12 minutes it runs to. But that's not bad to go from having nothing to installing WebSphere, setting up profiles, deploying an application and starting an application. So let's have a look at some of the detail of what's been done here. It's a little bit easier for folks inside UrbanCode for the very first time, kind of lose track of where we are. So we went into a component process there. The reason why it says deployment of component at the top there. And so if I go back to our diagram, we are in the detail of looking at the results of running one of these. If I use the button that is shown over here, view application process, I can flip back up to here and I can look at the high level view of deploying the application. So my application orchestration layer I'm looking at here shows that we created and started the broker. We can drill into that, and then we deploy to WebSphere message broker. So let's have a look at creating the queue. Let's have a look at creating the queue manager. We have 3 windows across here, 3 pieces of information that we can look at for each step. The first is the output log, this little command window. And if we look at that, what we are seeing here is the stuff that would have scrolled up the screen if we had to run this command by hand. So there it says creating a queue manager, setup complete at the bottom. That's what we're looking for. And it tells us the directory it's created and so on. What we also see for that command is we see the input parameters. So we can see the command that was used and the queue name. We can also see the output parameters, which is not particularly exciting here. An exit code of 0 and status of success is pretty good in itself, I suppose. But there's some other operations. We create lots of output content. And you can have steps that create output content and then get other steps afterwards that consume that output content. So if you want a step to go and find something out about a particular machine, you can do that, and then you can publish that as an output property from a step, and then have something else consume that, maybe a switch operation to go into different routes based on the results of one of those commands. If we start the Queue Manager service, let's have a look at that. Basically, that was running a command line operation, and the command just exited with an exit code of 0. We didn't get any command output for that one. If there was errors, we probably would have got those, and they would have appeared in here, but that was a successful operation. Let's go back now to having a look at the broker deployment. So we downloaded the artifacts, and if you remember, we had a file called barfile.bar that was deployed, that was downloaded, well, the file to be deployed. The version label that we've identified is version 3.0 that we're working with. See the file we downloaded. So we then go and create the broker, and we see the result of that command. And ultimately down here we run the deploy of the broker file. It says deploy in the var file using the timeout of 60,000. And then we go and set some broker properties. I'm not sure what the output is on here. Oh yeah, we just go and set some arbitrary property that I defined with JDBC provider to a thread from null on that broker. And that's it. There are lots of additional things that you can do around this, but that is how we deploy content into that particular technology. We can look at the history, and we can see what's happened, previous operations. You can drill down into any of this. So we can see what's in our environment now. We can see what version has been deployed into that particular environment. If we have other environments that we deployed into, we can see the difference here. So let's do a compare. Now, I know there's only one component in there, but if there were 20 components in there, it might be kind of difficult to see which ones were different. So here we can see which version is in development, which version is in QA, and see where the differences are. So if you picture your more real-life situation where you might have 30 components, it might be useful to have that. Now, that's really come to the end of what I wanted to show you today. So let's just to recap for a second. We did a quick introduction to UrbanCode Deploy, and we looked at the content of UrbanCode and what makes up the information that you supply to UrbanCode. We then looked at the component processes for MQ and broker. We looked at the application process overall. We talked at length around properties, around how we define those, and looked at the resources and the nice separation that we can have between the processes that perform the operations on the technologies here and the actual resources that they work on. We have a one-day workshop that you are very welcome to attend. I think the next one is some point in October. If you were to ask Helen or Tajinder, they would be able to register you with a place on that. What we do in those one-day workshops is they are in the IBM South Bank offices in London, and you walk in and there is nothing installed, nothing in the UrbanCode environment at all as you sit down in front of a machine. It's not one of these workshops with a ton of seeded content that you think, well, how did all that get there and what did it take to get to this point? You start off with your own UrbanCode environment that has nothing in it, and everything that happens in there and everything that gets deployed and created is done by you during the day. So it's brilliant for doing that. I'm doing one on Wednesday with a particular customer down in IBM in the Hursley offices, actually, as it happens. So we can run them for your own company, but the first thing you may want to do is come along to one of the public ones that we have around the second week in October, I think it is.